Welcome to Dead Folks Tales, a New Orleans-centric podcast exploring Southern Gothic stories, history, and hauntings, with your host, paranormal and fantasy author, Nola Nash. Find out more at nolanash.com. Now, let's talk about dead people.
Welcome to the show, folks. Tonight, we are doing things a little bit differently thanks to a scheduling snafu. It's just me tonight. So we were going to have Denny Morgan from Second Line Tours on with us, and we will catch back up with Denny another night. But I decided, while I have your attention, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about some stories that inspired some of my work. And you know that I have the Crescent City series that is based in New Orleans. So I thought I would tell you guys some of my own stories. We're going to lean a little heavily on the comments tonight. So make sure that you get those comments posted in the chat, and I will do my best to answer any of your burning questions that you may have about my books and some of the stories that I'm going to tell you for this time that we have together. So brace yourselves. Nola's freewheeling. You never know what's going to happen here. So here we go. The Crescent City series takes place in 1830s New Orleans, right at the turn of the decade there. So 1829 and 1830. Oftentimes, when authors write historical fiction, they've zeroed in on either a particular event or a particular person that they are trying to work into the story. Sometimes what we need is more of a cultural viewpoint at the time. We need some political event. There's usually a reason. Authors don't typically kind of willy-nilly choose a time period. So for me, the 1830s, 1829, 1830 as a setting was important. And I've had so many people ask me in the past, of all the times that you could have set something in New Orleans, why 1830? And I'll tell you why. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that at that time, magic, mystery, religion, culture, all of those things were sort of accepted and blended very well together. And so with all of the religion, all of the voodoo, the Catholic nuns that were there, we've got a voodoo priestess here. We've got all of these people from all of these different perspectives that blended together in the story. And that was a great time period for that to happen. Another reason that I used that particular time period is because in the books that I write, when I write historical fiction, I use often real people. And one of the very first characters that you meet is, of course, the priest who comes in at the very beginning. And Father Antoine, Pere Antoine in New Orleans, was a real person. And in fact, Father Antoine was a very well-loved priest in New Orleans. He was actually friends with our wonderful Marie Laveau, of course, our voodoo queen of New Orleans. And the two of them did a lot of charity work together. They served the poor together. They worked with yellow fever victims and nursed the sick together. And I really loved that there was that juxtaposition between voodoo and the church at the time. So all of these things were really important as I chose this character. And Father Antoine, who dies almost immediately, so no big spoilers here. We know that he dies in the very first couple of chapters there. He dies, and I used the death date that we have for Father Antoine. So actually choosing him as a historical figure was the reason for that. So we used Father Antoine. I used Father Antoine as the basis, and his date. It's the date of his death as the basis for choosing the time period for that book series. And I've done this a few times. I have another book series that is not out yet that I actually set in 1850s New Orleans, right at the turn of that decade, 1848, 1850. The series kind of plays along those lines. There was a reason for that as well. And of course, being me, it had to do with the historical figure that I wanted to work into the book. Most of the book, you go merrily along. They're all fictional characters, but there is one character that shows up. And she had a huge impact on the city of New Orleans. There are some great biographies written about Michaela Almonester, the Countess de Pontalba. And Michaela was a huge presence, like I said, not just by her personality, which was definitely something special, but her family, her father before her, and then she herself, is actually responsible for the buildings that are around Jackson Square. So you look at the cathedral, St. Louis Cathedral, the two buildings on either side, the Cabildo and the Presbytere. Those were originally built by her father. And in a fire, much of the cathedral was destroyed. Michaela was the one who paid for the renovations. Also, there are two twin buildings that flank Jackson Square and the park right there. And that park itself, and the square and the red buildings, the twin buildings that are on either side of it, are all Michaela Almonester. She was the one, the Baroness de Pontalba. I say Countess before, she was the Baroness de Pontalba. The Baroness de Pontalba, she's the one who paid for all of that. And in fact, she oversaw it and its construction personally. She was not one to take any crap off of anybody. I mean, this was a woman who had been married as a teenager off to a cousin she didn't know, that she didn't want to be married to. They did not get along. It was horrible. Her father-in-law only wanted her money, which she had lots of, but she was not very well liked by that family, mostly because she didn't want to be there too. And she was very outspoken. She tried to work things out with them. It didn't work. And she tried to get away from them. Didn't really work very successfully until she actually was shot at point blank range with a dueling pistol by her father-in-law. And her father-in-law, in his failed attempt to kill her, and she put a hand over her chest to block it, and blew off part of her hand. And so she always wore gloves to cover that up, and a high neckline to cover the disfigurement to her chest. But it was a failed murder attempt. Father-in-law ended up killing himself, and so she was able to get away from that family. And because she was in France and she was, with French law, she had to really work for a while to actually claim back her money, her fortune. And she did. And when she did, she moved back home to New Orleans for a while. And that is when she started to build on her father's legacy and create Jackson Square to being what it is that we see it today. The Pontalba buildings are what they're called on either side of the square. So Michaela Almonester was a key figure. And again, she doesn't come in until the end of the book. But because she's a real person, I needed to frame that book around her, which allowed me then, knowing that I wanted to use her, which allowed me to kind of focus my research on a specific time period, as opposed to all of the changes that would have been happening around various decades at that time, especially if we had creeped a little closer to the Civil War. But the 1850s, New Orleans still in its heyday, lots of high society things going on, growth in the city at that time. And so it made a very fun place to use, a very fun time period to use. So using real people, using real events. When you're reading historical fiction, look for those things. Look for those things that the author has put in there and think through why they included that, because that is something that the author thought through. Odds are they did not just go, we'll set it here, or we'll set it at this time. They've done something very purposeful when they've done that. Authors put their heart and soul into every word that they put on a page. And so whatever they have chosen to do with the time period has been done for a particular reason. And like I said, with the Crescent City series, 1830 depended on Father Antoine. With the Sylvie series that is not out yet, it is historical fiction, historical romance. That series is set in 1850 because of Michaela Almonester. And lots of the Traveler that's coming out in March. There are lots of historical figures that are in that book as well, because she is traveling through memories of past lives to learn about what her destiny truly is, that she's meant for, that she's not in yet. She's got to figure out how to get there. And as she's going through all of these things, she's learning from these past lives, but in those past lives, there are events and people that were historical. They really happened. And so the challenge for me was then to go through all of the history, make sure I wasn't overlapping anyone in all of these different places, because that wouldn't have made sense, right? If she's traveling through past lives, her lives would not have overlapped. So she's going through a timeline, and so did I have to go through the timeline and find these people that would have the right impact on her. And so that drove the particular time periods that her past lives would have been that I was writing about. So these things are very intentional, and the authors are putting a lot into that. Lots of author friends and I have had these conversations before. When you get a chance to talk to an author and they have written something that is historical fiction, or even something that is maybe more modern, but perhaps deals with political crimes or things like that, ask that author, when you get the chance to ask the questions, what was it that made them choose that time period? Or what was it about that location that spoke to them for this particular story? Because they have considered that. Authors get asked a lot of the same questions. We get asked, did you always want to be a writer? That's a question, hands down, we've answered 2,000 times. When did you first know that you wanted to be a writer? What was the process for getting published? All of these are these are questions we're used to answering. We know people are curious about that, and that's fine. Ask those questions. But if you really want to get an author's attention, ask them some of those details that other people just aren't going to. Like, why that time period? Why that location? What was it about that particular time or place that made it the perfect fit for the story you wanted to tell? Most of the time, an author is not going to go, 1830s New Orleans, I want to write a story about that. No, most of the time, they're going to have the story first, the characters, they're going to have a conflict, they're going to have something that they want to surround with the right location and the right time period. So the story almost always is going to come first. Wherever that is set, is a very specific, intentional decision. So ask the authors that. There's usually a good reason for it, and there's oftentimes a great story behind the story itself when you ask those detailed questions. Also, you never know who is a real person from history that someone is going to sneak into a story. They're kind of like Easter eggs for me. People didn't know, most of my readers didn't know that Father Antoine was a real person. They did not know his story, and I know his story. I don't get into his story. It's not important to the story that I'm telling in that book, what Father Antoine's past is. I only needed that moment of his death, to frame him as a character. But I know those things. And so it's kind of that Easter egg story for me to be able to share with people who ask that question. And so that's an interesting question for me to get. And I bet you anything, other authors would love to share those stories with you as well. So ask those questions when you get a chance. Those are great things for authors to talk about at book signings, those kinds of events where, they have the opportunity and the platform and the time, because it's their event. They have the time to get into those backstories and really share those things with you. Other things that are in the works for me and things that have to do with other stories. This is Nanowrimo. If you are in the book writing community, you have heard that word. You have seen that word. You may or may not know what it is, but Nanowrimo stands for National Novel Writing Month, and that is the month of November. And in that month of November, authors are challenged to get 50,000 words written, and it sounds like a lot, but it's actually not usually even a whole book. So think about that. Most of my books are around 80,000 words, maybe a little bit more. So it's not quite a whole book for me, but it's a really good chunk, a really good head start. If you're writing some of those epic fantasy kind of books, science fiction, because of all the world building that is involved in those tend to be longer even than my books. Those can be upwards of 90, 100,000 words. Maybe it's half a book that you've written. But the challenge is to get that many words on the page in the month of November, just to really focus your efforts and kind of write in a community of writers who are also trying to accomplish the same thing. So this is NaNoWriMo, and I am participating in NaNoWriMo this year. I've never done it before. So I'm really excited about it and also hugely intimidated by this. I am right at 14,000 words. It is November 9th. I have quite a ways to go. I've got some catching up to do, but it has been kind of an invigorating process. But the first thing was I needed a story to tell. I have other books that are in progress. I didn't want to be finishing a book as NaNoWriMo. To me, that seemed like kind of anticlimactic, I guess, to the challenge of getting that many words down. Other authors will have, different perspectives on that. It is all a personal decision what you're going to write about during your month. But for me, the month was all about starting something new, something that maybe I would not write for a while. I would just be putting it off and putting off that idea, but something I just really wanted to kind of tackle in that month. And for me, it's a new book. It's called House of Mirrors. And I'm excited about House of Mirrors because of the way that it came to me and the way that it's just sort of continuing to come to me and some of the interesting coincidences that are happening to me as I write this. So it is, of course, like so many of my things, driven by history. I was an English and a history double major in college. Somebody said, "What are you going to do with that? Write textbooks?" Kind of laughed. Ended up doing nothing with it for a very long time. But it is what drives my writing, my love of just the written word, the English language, and then the history and what we can do with the stories we can tell using history. And so, House of Mirrors is no different. House of Mirrors takes place in modern day Franklin, Tennessee, which is where I live, downtown Franklin. And well, I live in Brentwood, but they share a nice, neat little border there. They're very close together, just south of Nashville, Tennessee. And Franklin has a lot of stories to tell, and not a lot of people know a lot about the stories with Franklin. And having done some tours, done a few, some research, some reading, sparked by interest from the tours that I have done, just kind of being a tourist in my own town. I've always loved going around Franklin. I'm always telling myself, you really need to get to know your town. You need to find out about these things because you're fascinated by this little town. And there's a lot of history, historical markers everywhere, but you don't know anything about it. And you know so much about South Louisiana history. Learn about where you are, girl. So I finally did. And it actually, the impetus for that was the visit from my aunts over fall break. They were coming in from Oklahoma, needed some things to do with them. So we did the fun stuff, the tours in your own town. They wanted to see Franklin, they wanted to see Nashville, got to do lots of fun things. But we also got to tour downtown Franklin and we got to tour Carnton Plantation. And fascinating histories. The history of Carnton Plantation, really interesting. We talked about the Lotes House and the tour of the Lotes House on another show. Also, a very fabulous place. And we did the ghost tour of downtown Franklin, and there are several walking tours that you can take. The one that we did was a lot of fun. And ghost stories. Franklin doesn't talk about its ghost stories, but they're everywhere. And they're kind of all around you. But Franklin kind of keeps their ghost stories in the nice, neat little box of the ghost tours. We don't get all, it's not like New Orleans. We're going to have a real estate sign hanging there going haunted or not haunted, which, in New Orleans, they can actually make more money off of the haunted ones. Go figure. But Franklin doesn't really talk a whole lot about it except for things like the ghost tours. So it was a lot of fun to kind of think about, there's all of this around here too. So that got me thinking. And then the more that I researched, the more that I learned about some of the places around here and just the really rich history that has been right under my nose for the last 20 years. It really did inspire me for the NaNoWriMo book that I'm working on. And so I am using quite a bit of Franklin history woven, of course, because it's me, into something paranormal, a bit more paranormal fantasy driven, ghost stories galore in this book. And it's been a lot of fun to get to know the history around me. And again, it's been here all this time, just didn't go seek it out. So that story, the one that I'm working on for NaNoWriMo, was inspired by one particular story. And I'm not going to tell you what that story is. One particular story on the ghost tour. But in a writer's mind, we're going to hear that story and not go, oh, I'm going to write a whole book about that story. We're going to go, but what if the story was like this? And that's exactly what happened. I'm standing there on the sidewalk listening to the story and then going, but what if it was this way? And that's where the book came from. So I'm excited about this book because it has forced me into really looking at where I live, the stories that are surrounding me, stories that not a lot of people know that I'm enjoying getting to know. And I hope that once this book is finished, and it certainly probably won't be finished by the end of November for the Nanowrimo project, but hopefully, huge start. Really hoping. I've got my Nanowrimo bracelet on, got my stickers over here. I'm like trying to be inspired here to get those 50,000 words down. The story itself, I'm very excited about, and I hope that you will be too when it comes out. And I hope that it will. I hope that it gets polished, it gets, everything that it needs for this fun story about a town that not a lot of people know the history about and can get to know in this book in a very mysterious and supernatural way. So I'm excited about that one, and I hope that you will be too. And all of these books, again, are based around a story that someone else in history lived or told, and or both. And that's where some of those great nuggets for writing come from. So when you get the chance, ask those authors that question: why that time period? Why that location? Why did you focus on that political figure or that particular thing? Especially some of these, like the FBI thrillers. Why the FBI? Why them? Why not this other branch? What is it about the way that they work that made this something that is really exciting to read? So think about all of those questions when you get those chances to talk to those authors. And while you're thinking about those questions, I'm going to be working on my NaNoWriMo story, House of Mirrors, all about downtown Franklin, Tennessee. Did have the opportunity to go on another tour. And I've kind of gotten addicted to the local tours. It's maybe a bit of a problem. I should be writing and I'm going on tours, but all of the information that I'm gathering in this way it's very helpful to writing the story. It's inspirational to the story. And there's all these tiny little nuggets because as a writer, that's what I'm looking for, those tiny little nuggets that other people aren't necessarily latching on to, those details of the story that I can then work into my writing. I got to tour the Carter House, which is directly across the street from the Lotes House in downtown Franklin on Columbia Avenue. Fabulous tour guide. Hats off to Lyle. He was fantastic. And if you get the chance to go to Franklin, Tennessee, make sure that you're taking those historical tours. There's some great information about what makes Franklin, Tennessee actually one of the most impactful cities, the most impactful battles of the American Civil War. Tragic, horrible history that happened here in Franklin, Tennessee. You tend to hear more about the Battle of Nashville, but there were actually more casualties in the Battle of Franklin on both sides. And so some fascinating history there, some interesting stories about people, the people that were involved on both sides of that conflict. Some great tales that can be told of bravery on both sides, sacrifice on both sides, and just horror on both sides. So interesting history to learn about there, and just some fascinating stories about the people of Franklin, which was, they were under occupation for a while. There was a fire in Franklin. I mean, all kinds of things that, as somebody who's lived here for 20 years, didn't hear a whole lot about. So it's interesting stuff. Go look around the town where you live. Go read those historical markers. Think about what those stories are and what authors might take from that. Think like a writer. What part of that story is actually going to be the most interesting to latch onto and to build from? So if you're thinking about writing a book, if you are just thinking about, hey, I should learn a little bit more about where I live, go for it. Go find those stories that your town has to tell, because you will not regret it. You're surrounded by history. You're surrounded by stories every single day. So I hope that you have enjoyed this freewheeling episode of Dead Folks Tales. It's been a little different. All kinds of things happening today. I've got all kinds of red exclamation points. I'm not sure if this went out on Facebook or not. We'll see. But anyway, I am so glad that you joined me, and hopefully enjoyed. I'll get my words right eventually. I promise you they're better when I put them on paper. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, freewheeling style. It's Nola. You never know what's going to happen with me. And I will see you next time when we talk about dead people.
Dead Folks Tales is a copywritten podcast of Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. Special thanks to producer Roman Suritin and executive producer Pam Stack. Join us next week for another episode of Dead Folks Tales.